Well, I think I better get going. So, luckily, welcome folks here in our sanctuary, and I see our camera going. Welcome folks, if you're with us on Facebook or live or later on. Welcome. We're going to talk about one of my favorite Old Testament books, and that is the book of Esther. And the reason it's my favorite, and I may have said this even at some other point, the reason I love Esther is long ago when I was in seminary, which now is a lot longer ago than I would think. You know, it's coming up. I started seminary over 40 years ago. But the seminary I attended out in California, I took both Greek and Hebrew. And the way they taught language, those languages at my seminary, was when I was studying Greek, all of our study was in the book of Acts. You know, the book of Acts was our textbook for learning Greek. And when it came to Hebrew, our textbook for Hebrew was Esther. And so I spent 12 hours of Hebrew study focused only on the book of Esther. And they used what they called the inductive method, which was on the first day, after we at least sort of learned the alphabet. You know, you have to learn the alphabet first because the Hebrew alphabet looks nothing like our alphabet. Plus, you read it from right to left instead of left to right. So the book opens this way instead of this way. I mean, everything's backwards and from the way we think about language and letters and books and everything. So once you at least learn the alphabet of Hebrew, then once you got the alphabet, they would say, all right, your textbook, let's look at Esther chapter 1, verse 1, word 1. What is the first word in the book of Esther? And it happens to be Malak, which is the Hebrew word for king. Now, it may not be the first word in our English translation, but the first in the actual Hebrew Bible, the first word in Esther is Malak, which is the Hebrew word for king. And so, all right, let's stop and study this word and see what the letters that make up that word are. And, once we spent some time figuring out the first word of the book of Esther, all right, let's go to the second word. And that's literally, when I say I read Esther one word at a time, I mean we read Esther one word at a time. Huh? No, we're not going to do that tonight. No, we're not going to do it in Hebrew. We're going to do it in English. And although I may occasionally reference a Hebrew word, but we're going to do it in English. We're not going to do it a word at a time. But you'd think that would make me hate the book, having done that. But no, rather than that, I think they chose wisely because it is not that lengthy a book. It has a interesting plot. It moves quickly. It has a lot of really interest, and it reads a lot like a little short story or novel or a TV miniseries. It has a lot of it has heroes and villains and intrigue and coincidence and all kinds of things. And so the book of Esther is a favorite of mine for that reason. It's also fascinating for lots of reasons. One of the reasons that the book of Esther is kind of fascinating is it almost didn't make it into the Bible. And one of those things when you're at least growing up in the church, you kind of just think, well, the Bible has just always been the Bible, and you start to say, well, there's 66 books in the Bible. Who decided that those 66 books were in the Bible and other books are not in the Bible? Who made that decision that these 66 books are the inspired books, that God inspired these books to be in the scriptures, and the other books that were written at the same time about the people of Israel or about Jesus don't get in the Bible. And it is a process. For us Christians, the final list of what books are in the New Testament was not finalized until the 4th century. The church had to make a decision about what books were going to be in the Bible. And the Hebrew Bible it was not so much a council of bishops or a church council that finally made the decision. It was more rabbis across the century began to consider some books official, or the technical word is canon, not like a cannon you shoot a cannonball. The word canon means the official list of books. What is the canon of the Bible? What is the official books that are in and those that are out? And if you read the New Testament and you know that the Pharisees and the Sadducees didn't see eye to eye on things, one of the things the Pharisees and the Sadducees disagreed about was what books belonged in the Bible. Because the Sadducees only accepted as authoritative the first 5 books, the so-called books of Moses, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. For the Sadducees, only those 5 books had authority. For the Pharisees, those 5 books plus many of the other books of the prophets also had authority. The Jews tended to divide the scripture into 3 sections, what they called the law, the prophets, and the writings. The law would be those first 5 books, sometimes called the books of Moses, sometimes called the Pentateuch. It just means 5 books. The prophets would be all those books that are, Isaiah and Elijah and all those books, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, or 1st and 2nd Kings, etc., etc. And those would be the, quote, prophets, major prophets and minor prophets. And then the writings would be the Psalms, the Proverbs, the Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, etc. And so they divided the scripture into these sections. And Esther just about didn't make it in. Does anybody know why Esther almost didn't make it into the Bible? What? It never mentions God. The book of Esther never mentions God. It implies God. That's part of the book. Part of the point of the book is God is working, and things that seem like coincidence aren't really coincidence. The way things unfold are not really random, and we're going to see that. But because the book of Esther never mentions God, a lot of people say, well, it doesn't belong in the Bible if it doesn't mention God. But those who said, well, it doesn't mention him by name, but he's there. He is inferred, he is implied, he's understood to be at work even though they don't call him by name. So those who believe that Esther was worthy of being in the scriptures did finally win the day. But it was sort of barely make it in by the skin of its teeth. So Esther was one of the last books added to the scriptures. And that argument was held by the Jews. The argument was held again by the Christians. Well, should we really have this book in our Bible? Because it doesn't seem to mention God. That argument was fought first by Jews and it was fought by Christians. But in both cases, it's in the book. And so Esther did make it into the canon, this official list of scripture. Now, before we get to the first word of Esther, before we get to Malach and the first word, where does it take place in history? And to do that, I have a handout here. And this, you want to help with that? No chart. Some charts have too much information, some don't have enough, and so this one I've tried to find one that was somewhat in between having too much information and not having enough information about the period from about 650 BC to about 400 BC. So this chart is trying to show us what was happening from about 650 BC till about 400 BC. So let's think about that period of time, because you have to think about this in terms of empires. And, I'll try not to make this the whole thing, but you have to kind of put this in a spot in history. So make sure you get a handout. Would you grab one too? So, the thing that often is confusing to us as we are just reading through the Old Testament, and I've said this before too, the books of the Old Testament are not chronological. When you get to the prophets, they're not chronological. They jump back and forth. You say, why in the world are they not chronological? Because the Jewish people didn't organize them chronologically. They organized them from long book to short book. And we in the West would go, that's crazy. And they would say the way we do it is crazy. So the books are not organized chronologically. They're organized from the long books at the front and the short books at the back. And so that's why they jump back and forth. But from the books of Kings, especially Samuel and Kings, we get a sense of what the flow is of history. Just quick recap. We have, I talked about Exodus before the break. Spoiler alert, they occupy Canaan. They cross the Jordan, they occupy Canaan, they divide Canaan up into the 12 tribes, they conquer the Philistines, etc. Okay? The first king of Israel is Saul. He's not a good king. That whole story ends up with David becoming the next king. And David is a great king of Israel, the 12 tribes. His son Solomon is an even greater king in terms of wealth and power. His son Rehoboam is not a good king. And Israel splits into two halves. The northern half of 10 tribes retains the name Israel. The southern 2 tribes is called Judah or Judea, after the largest tribe. So there's this divided kingdom. And we read about that in the Old Testament. The northern kingdom of Israel, the southern kingdom of Judea. In around 722 BC, the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, are conquered by the Assyrian Empire. And you see that here, the Assyrian Empire. The Assyrian Empire would be the modern country of Syria. So the Syrian Empire conquers the northern 10 tribes, and those tribes then basically are melted and mixed into the larger region of the Assyrian Empire. Sometimes people wrongly call them the 10 lost tribes. They're not lost. They're like you pour a bottle of ink into a bathtub. They just, dissipate, intermarry with other people. That's what the Assyrians would do. They would cart some of them off to other countries. They would bring in other foreign people. And some of the descendants of those 10 northern tribes end up becoming, by the New Testament time, become what we would call the Samaritans. But the southern kingdom is not conquered by the Assyrians. They are able to withstand Assyria for a while until about 586 BC, when the southern kingdom is conquered by the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar comes into Judea, conquers the Judeans, the Jews, breaks down the walls of Jerusalem, destroys the temple of Solomon, takes the king into captivity in Babylon, and just the Jews become under the thumb of Babylon. And books like Daniel take place during what's called the Babylonian captivity, because the best and the brightest Jews from Judea are taken as slaves into Babylon. Like Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and all those guys we read about in Daniel. Babylon is Iraq. Okay? Assyria is Syria. Babylon is Iraq. The Babylonian Empire, which is a brutal empire, is then finally conquered by the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire, that's Iran. Okay? When we think of Persia, we're talking about Iran. So the empire goes from Syria to Iraq to Iran. Because sometimes when we read about these things like Babylon and Assyria, we're thinking it's like a mythical place like, Narnia or something, or Mordor. I mean, these are real places that are still in the Middle East today. So the Persian Empire conquers the Babylonian Empire. Cyrus, the king of the Persian Empire, allows the Jews to go back to Jerusalem because they've been in captivity away from Jerusalem for about a couple of generations. He allows the Jews, the captive Jews, to go back to Jerusalem, where we read about eventually in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. They go back, they rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. They build what was called the Second Temple. Because the first temple, the magnificent Temple of Solomon, is in ruins. They build a second temple, which is not nearly as magnificent as the first temple, but they do rebuild a temple. It's called the Second Temple. And those events are all in the Old Testament. Now, why do I say all that? Because where does Esther fall in all of that? If you look down there, you see the book of Esther there. And underneath it, it has the rulers of the Persian Empire, starting with Cyrus, and then we got Darius, and you get over to Xerxes. This Xerxes is the king of Persia that we read about in the book of Esther. Okay? So Xerxes is the king of Persia that is the king in Esther. In the Hebrew, he's called Ahasuerus, but it's the same guy. It's Xerxes. And most English translation actually just call him Xerxes, although in Hebrew we had to call him Ahasuerus. But that's where Esther takes place, because when Cyrus says to the Jews that were in captivity, had been taken by the Babylonians, when Persia conquers Babylon and he says, you can go back to Jerusalem, many of them go back, but many of them don't. There remains a sizable Jewish population in Persia. Okay? There remains a sizable Jewish population in Persia, which there was still a sizable Jewish population in Persia really up until the 20th century. There's not very many Jews in Iran today. But there was a sizable Jewish population in those countries until really the 20th century, until really the rise of radical Islam. Islam has not always been as radical as it is now. So this story takes place in Persia, with the Jewish population being a minority population among the Persian people, with Xerxes as the king. And Xerxes is a well-known historical figure outside of the Bible. Lots of movies feature Xerxes. I want to say the movie 300 takes place within the same time period. Xerxes is a figure in history that was known for being very violent, very short-tempered, very impatient, and having a very voracious appetite for women. So Xerxes is known historically from lots of other sources. Shortly after the events of Esther, Xerxes invades Greece and fails. And the next empire after the Persian Empire is the Greek Empire. And then we get into the whole time of Alexander the Great and all those folks. And, I know when I was in high school studying world history, I didn't know any of this. I don't know if it was covered when you did world history in high school, if any of this was covered about the change of empires from the Assyrian Empire to the Babylonian Empire to the Persian Empire to the Greek Empire to the Roman Empire, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't know any of this until I became more familiar with it because of biblical studies. But anyway, so all of that to say, that's when this story is taking place. And this is the Persian Empire and it's King Xerxes. So having said that, let's start. Esther 1:1. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 120 provinces stretching from India to Cush. Okay, how big was the Persian Empire? Okay, here's a map to show something about the size of the Persian Empire. And if you start to look at that and try to kind of make sense of all these places that have names different from the names they have now, or at least a lot of them have different names. Not all of them have different names. But you see, this is a huge, huge empire. You see all the way to India over on the eastern side of the map. You see all the way almost on the verge of Greece on the far western side. You see it all the way to the Black Sea and all around the Caspian Sea, all the way down to the Persian Gulf, all through Palestine, all into the northern part of Egypt, all around the Mediterranean. This is the Persian Empire. And some of these towns you might recognize. In Egypt, you can see Thebes and Memphis. You see some of those biblical names up around Israel. You see Palestine. You see Cappadocia and Phrygia. You see Greece over there. Over in India, you can see some of those names that are obviously very Indian names, Parthia, et cetera, et cetera. But this is just to give you a sense. The Persian Empire is a huge empire. And Dalton, come get a map or two if you'd like one up here on the front. So this is what we're talking about when it says that the empire stretched from India to Cush. It says, at that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and for the 3rd year of his reign, so early on in his reign, he gave a banquet for all of his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes, the nobles, and the provinces were present. So he's giving a giant banquet. And how long did the banquet last? For 180 days. So 6 months. A 6-month banquet. Now, as I was reading, really? Well, the various princes from the 127 provinces probably didn't all come at one time. It was probably a rolling time. It's a banquet. What it really was an opportunity for him to show off, to display his wealth and his power. So there, verse 4. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. So Persia is an incredibly wealthy empire at this time. Archaeologists have found some of the things mentioned here, the goblets made of solid gold, etc. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people, from the least to the greatest, who were in the citadel of Susa. So not even just the powerful and the princes and the governors and the satraps and the muckety-mucks, even the common folks were allowed to come into the gardens and see some of the splendor and wealth of King Xerxes. The garden, verse 6, had hangings of white and blue linen, fastened with cords of white linen, purple material and silver rings on marble pillars. And this book goes into great detail about the splendor of these things. The couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and costly stones. Wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. Royal wine was abundant, in keeping with the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink in his own way. But the king instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man what he wished. So this just trying to tell us, this is a think wealth and splendor and majesty and power and excess, things made of silver and gold everywhere. It is a big... Now, it's only the men. The banquet's only for the men. It's not open to the women. It's just for the men. And because it says, verse 9, Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace. So he's giving this magnificent banquet for the men, and the queen is also having a banquet for the women, but they're separate. On the seventh day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from the wine, aka he's drunk, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, and remember, some of these times I'm glad I don't always have to explain this when there's kids in the room. A eunuch are male servants of a king who have been castrated. Why are they castrated? So they can be trusted around the women. They castrate the eunuchs so that they can be trusted around the women. So he had all kinds of male servants who were castrated serving him. He commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, and it gives their 7 names. I'm not going to even go through their names. And one of my friends who's a pastor, when he comes to this passage, he's like, and hard word, and he doesn't even attempt to pronounce all the names. I probably could since of my time with the Hebrew class, but I'm not going to go with that. But he commands the eunuchs to bring before him Queen Vashti wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. So in other words, he's having an all-male party. He says, let me show you all my wealth, let me show you all my riches, let me show you all my gold goblets, let me show you all my everything. Now let me show you my queen all dressed up. Let me bring her in for you to gander at. Let me bring the queen in so I can display her something else that is mine, something else for me to display for you men. So he tells the eunuchs, go bring the queen in, dressed to the nines, bring the queen in. But, verse 12, when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. She refused to come and be displayed. She refused to come in and stand on a pedestal for the men to admire. And the king became furious and burned with anger. She told the king, no. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in matters of the law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. Again, the name of 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and were highest in the kingdom. Verse 15, according to the law, what must be done to Queen Vashti? This isn't supposed to happen. She's not supposed to tell me no. Nobody tells me no. What's supposed to happen? She has not obeyed the commands of King Xerxes and the eunuchs to be taken to her. Then one of these nobles, Memucan, replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the people in all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women. And so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she wouldn't come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who've heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles the same way, there will be no end of disrespect and discord. In other words, if the women hear that the queen got away with saying no to the king, they'll think they can say no to their husbands. And we can't have that. We cannot have the word get out that the queen was allowed to tell him no. Because if she's allowed to tell him no, all the women in the kingdom are going to get the idea that they can say no to their husbands. And we can't have that. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed. That's an important little thing there. These laws cannot be repealed. That's going to come into play later in the story. That Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. She won't come in. I know what we'll do to her. We'll tell her she can't come in. She won't come in. Well, here's what we're going to do to her. We're going to tell her she can't come in. I mean, you're like, isn't that kind of what she doesn't want to do anyway? She's never going to come into the presence of the king again. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all the vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. So, she's out as queen. Got to find a new queen, and then that will calm this idea that the women might have that they're allowed to say no to their husbands. That'll nip that in the bud. So that's how this piece falls. Vashti is out as queen. We need a new queen. So, okay, there's going to be a series of dominoes fall in this story. This is the first domino. There's a job opening for queen. The king and his nobles were pleased with the advice, so the king did as Mumakan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, proclaiming in each people's tongue that every man should be ruler over his own household. Which was probably already pretty much in this culture already the reality. But just in case anybody got a wrong idea, just to make sure they understood that every man is king of his castle. They wanted that to be made known. Chapter 2. Later, when the anger of King Xerxes had subsided, so when he calmed down and sobered up, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and what he decreed about her. The king's personal attendants proposed, let a search be made for beautiful young virgins for the king. Let the king appoint commissioners in every province of his realm to bring all of these beautiful girls into the harem at the citadel of Susa. Let them be placed under the care of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who's in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Then let the girl who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This advice appealed to the king, and he followed it. So, I'm again talking about when you adapt these things to screen or stage, the idea, okay, here's the idea. Vashti's out. In every province, we're going to look for the most beautiful young virgin. We're going to bring them in to the capital. And the king is going to sleep with all of them and pick one to be queen. That's the idea. That's how they're going to get a new queen, is bringing all the young virgins into the harem and then let them take turns with the king, and the one that pleases him the most will be queen. So, which is kind of icky in lots of ways, but this is the king being able to be absolute ruler. And it's a royal Miss Persia contest. It's a royal beauty pageant to bring all the young virgins, the most beautiful young virgin from every province. So there's 127 provinces, and each province is supposed to bring the most beautiful virgin to the harem, and he gets his pick. So, this is the plan to get a new queen for Xerxes, which Xerxes is pretty happy about. Now, verse 5. Now, switching scenes for a minute, there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew, a Jewish man of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, who'd been carried into the exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. You do the timeline and you realize, okay, it's not Mordecai who was carried into there by Nebuchadnezzar, because that would make him over 100 years old. It was his grandfather that they mention here, who was part of the exiles that came out of Israel into Babylon before Babylon was conquered by Persia. So Mordecai is a descendant of one of the Babylonian captives that was brought out of Israel, or brought out of Judea, into Babylon, which is now under the control of Persia. So he's a Jew. He's from the tribe of Benjamin. The two tribes that were, the two southern tribes were Judah and Benjamin. So that's who this fellow Mordecai is. And it says he had been carried, his grandfather had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah. That was the last king of Judah who was carted off to Babylon by the Babylonians. The last king of Judah, they drug him to Babylon with fish hooks in his mouth, and then blinded him, poked his eyes out. That's what happened to the last king of Judah by the Babylonians. So Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. The girl, who was also known as Esther, so she has two names, Hadassah and Esther, same girl, same woman, was lovely in form and feature, and Mordecai had taken her in as his own daughter when her mother and father died. So he is her older cousin who had become a second father to her. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many girls were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai, the eunuch in charge of the virgins. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who was in charge of the harem. And the idea is that these girls didn't volunteer for this. They just said, what's the prettiest girl in the village? Okay, you. Okay, you're coming with us. They didn't step up and volunteer for this. They were told they were going to be a part of this royal beauty contest. They were collected and brought to the king's harem. Esther was taken to the king's palace, entrusted to Haggai, who was in charge of the harem. The girl pleased him and won his favor, as in, we're talking about the eunuch, the guy in charge of the harem. There are actually, we're going to find out there are two harems, or actually the way they would say it, and they would say harem, but we would say in English harem. There were two harems. There was the harem of the virgins and the harem of the concubines. Once the girl had slept with the king, she was moved from the harem of the virgins to the harem of the concubines. The concubines were no longer virgins because they had had their night with the king. But she's in the harem of the virgins. So she wins the favor of the eunuch in charge of the virgins. Immediately, he provided her with her beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 maids selected from the king's palace and moved her and her maids to the best place in the harem. So he takes a liking to Esther and gives her special treatments, beauty products, good food, etc., etc. Esther had not, verse 10, Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Do not tell them you're Jewish. Do not let them know you're Jewish. Because Mordecai knows that the Jews were second-class citizens in Persia. he knew that there was anti-Semitism in Persia. They had been brought there as slaves. They'd settled there, but they were never fully embraced. They worshipped a different god. They had different customs. They didn't mingle, really. They were kind of, they stayed together. And so there was anti-Semitism among the Persians. And some things don't change in thousands of years. Some things, people who think the troubles in the Middle East are a new phenomenon. I mean, what has happened in the Middle East, the conflict in the Middle East, the hatred in the Middle East, it goes back thousands and thousands of years. It is not a new thing in any way. It's all thousands of years of hostility. Every day, he being Mordecai, verse 11, walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem, to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. So they do these, they brought her into the harem of the virgins, and they spend months of beauty treatments and skin care, and probably a lot of these girls were considered too skinny, and they probably try to, get them a little plumper, and et cetera, before they have their night with the king. So they're given all these treatments in the harem. Verse 12, before a girl's turn came to go into King Xerxes, she had to complete 12 months of beauty treatments prescribed for the women. 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 with perfume and cosmetics. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given her to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go there, and in the morning return to another part of the harem to the care of Shazgaz, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the concubines. So after she spent the night with the king, she was moved from the harem of the virgins to the harem of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned her by name. So this is this process of how is the king going to pick his favorite? How is the king going to pick the new queen? When the turn came for Esther, the girl that Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to King Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her the queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. Let me pause there for a minute. Anything in this story surprise you? Anything in the story seem... Anything in the story surprising to how it was, what happened? Huh? Well, she had to have the 6 months of the beauty treatments. Yeah. Just took one night. Yeah. For him to go, yep, she's the one. What would you say? Yeah. Yeah. Where have you been all my life? There it is. She's suddenly like, okay, you're the one. You're my favorite. You get the crown. And he throws a big party, a big banquet, and she's the new queen. And Vashti's out. So we've established this whole Esther becomes the queen. She's not Xerxes' only female, but she is number one. She's the one who gets to wear the crown. She's his favorite. But even though she's now the queen, she does not live with him. She doesn't move to his bedchamber. She goes back to where the women stay, and it's only when he calls for her that she comes to him. It's not like suddenly, oh, well, she's now going to go live, in the royal suite with him. No, she goes back to the harem, and only when he wants her will he call for her. And that's an important thing that's going to come into play in the story later, too. She doesn't just get to walk in and go, "Hi, honey, good morning." No, she can only go and see the king when she is summoned. So that's going to come into the story later too. This is like a play or a novel or a TV show where they're dropping these things that are going to be important later on. One of the things that's going to be important later on, once a law is made, it can't be revoked. That's going to come into play later. She cannot enter the king's presence unless she's summoned. That's going to come into play later. She is not to reveal that she's Jewish because of the fear of anti-Semitism. That's going to come into play later. All these things, you have to hang on to these things because they're going to all play out as the story goes on. So, meanwhile, outside the palace, back to Mordecai. Mordecai, her surrogate father, has basically, once she's gone in, he's kind of camped out outside the palace, waiting to see what's going to happen to his adopted daughter, basically. What's going to happen to Esther. So he's hanging around by the palace gates, basically. He's out there. And here's we're going to have a little bit of something else that's going to come into play later. Mordecai, verse 19, chapter 2, 19. When the virgins were assembled a second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. So nobody even knows that she is related to Mordecai. Nobody's aware of her connection to Mordecai. She's kept her identity and her background and her nationality and all that secret. During the time that Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. Without revealing he's my cousin, but saying. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the two officials were hanged on a gallows. All of this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. So, Mordecai hangs out outside the palace gate. And he hears the chatter, he hears the whispering of these two guys who two are the guards who guarded the gate, that for some reason that we're not told why they are so angry at the king, but they are very dissatisfied with Xerxes, and they form a plot to assassinate him. But Mordecai overhears this, or it becomes made aware of this assassination plot. He gets word to Esther, these two men are planning an assassination attempt against Xerxes. She gets word to Xerxes, and they investigate, and sure enough, they arrest the two men, and they're executed. They're hanged. And the whole episode is recorded in the annals of the palace record book. A plot was discovered on this day by these two conspirators. It was discovered by Mordecai outside of the thing and reported in, and then they were found out and they were executed. It's all recorded in a book. Mordecai's role in tipping them off about the assassination attempt. And that's placed in a book. And that's going to come up and be important later too. Okay? The fact that is recorded in a book is going to come up and be important in the story later on also. So there's things you have to keep track of, these things that are going to be little breadcrumbs all the way through that are going to all come together eventually, like the plot of a movie. Okay. Yeah. I think later on, yes, he is referred to as Mordecai the Jew by, I think we're going to get there, that it is known that he's Jewish, yes. But his connection to Esther is not clear at that point. That he's a Jew, I'm not sure that it's recorded that he's a Jew. It's going to come into play later on. It's going to be discovered that he is a Jew, but I'm not sure of how they read it. It's a little unclear as to when they record it. Does it say Mordecai the Jew, or does it just say Mordecai? But his Judaism is going to come into play later on, definitely, in not a good way. So, we're going to chapter 3. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all of the king's other nobles. So this fellow named Haman becomes the equivalent of, prime minister or chief of staff, or however you want to call him, this fellow Haman. Now, what's interesting, at least to me, there is a Jewish holiday called Purim. Have you ever heard of Purim? Or here in Oklahoma, Purim? There's a Jewish holiday called Purim, P-U-R-I-M. And it is a holiday that is about this story. And it is celebrated usually with a melodrama of this story. Sometimes done with actors, often done with puppets, and done in a very sort of over-the-top style. And when I say melodrama, this story is often dramatized in Jewish communities and Jewish cultures. This story is a play that is put on during the holiday of Purim or Purim. And when Haman enters the scene, when Haman, if it's a puppet, I'm doing a puppet here. when Haman comes on stage, or when the Haman puppet comes on stage, everybody knows to boo. Boo! Because Haman is the villain of this story. We say this story has heroes and villains. Esther's the heroine, Mordecai's the hero, and Haman is the villain, the dark-hearted villain. And this story, as we go on, we're going to see why does this story still resonate, and why is it put on as a play or a puppet show every year around this holiday called Purim? Because it is about the central villain, we're going to see, spoiler alert, the central villain is a man, Haman, who decides to try to exterminate the Jewish people, which takes on all kinds of significance in later eras, especially as it relates to the Holocaust. Haman is in many ways an early version of Hitler. Haman is a man committed to the destruction of the Jews. So when Haman comes on the scene, boo, boo, boo. So we meet Haman now. And Haman has been placed by Xerxes into a place of high responsibility, equivalent to chief of staff, prime minister, whatever you want to call it. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. So whenever Haman would walk, he's walking around, everybody would, bow and scrape in front of him because he's second in command of the king himself. Everybody would bow, everybody would kneel, everybody would, do that. When he would just walk through, people would bow to Haman. It says all the people at the king's gate would kneel down and pay honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Mordecai would not kneel down or bow down to Haman. Mordecai, we're to understand, although the name of God is never mentioned, remember, but I think we're to understand Mordecai is only going to bow to God. Mordecai is not going to bow to any secular ruler, especially a Persian ruler. Mordecai will not bow down. He will only bow down to the God of Israel. So when Mordecai walks by, everybody bows, except there's one guy who is conspicuous for not bowing, and that's Mordecai. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's command?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them that he was a Jew. So here you go, Bill, at this point. Mordecai the Jew will not bow down to Haman. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. He didn't care. 99 other people could bow down. That's not good enough. There's this one Jew who will not bow down to him, and that's stuck in his craw. He's not going to allow that. He was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all of Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. So because Mordecai the Jew would not bow down to Haman, Haman is so enraged by this slight that he doesn't want to just get revenge and punish Mordecai. He decides, I want not just to get rid of Mordecai the Jew, I want to get rid of all Jews. I want to get rid of all the Jews in the Persian Empire. I want to get rid of all Jews. So in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pur, P-U-R, that is the lot, cast lots. That's where the holiday Purim comes from, the casting of the pur, P-U-R. And just, again, in Hebrew, the way you make a word plural is you add I-M at the end. So one pur, two purim. A word for, we're Gentiles, us in the room, we're Gentiles. That means I'm a goy, but all of us together are goyim. That means Gentiles. One angel is a cherub. A whole bunch is cherubim. One is a seraph, more than one is a seraphim. Okay, and you see that even some hymns and some things. The I-M suffix is how you pluralize a word in Hebrew. Cherub, cherubim, seraph, seraphim, goy, goyim, etc. So Purim. So in the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, they cast the pur, that is the lot, in the presence of Haman to select a day and a month. And that lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. So they cast basically lots to figure out, let's pick a day. They're going to pick a day. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, and this is the slithery, slimy, snake-like way that Haman approaches the king. Haman said to King Xerxes, there's a certain people, doesn't say what they're called, there's a certain people dispersed and scattered among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom, whose customs are different from those of all the other people, and who do not obey the king's laws. It's not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will put 10,000 talents of silver into the royal treasury for the men who carry out this business. So he doesn't name them. He just says, there's this there's this people. They're weird. They're different. They're not like us. And they're living among us. And their customs are different from our customs. And they don't obey our laws, which is pretty much a lie. I think we should exterminate them. And I know it'll take manpower to carry out the extermination, but I'm willing to pay 10,000 talents of silver to help pay for the manpower to wipe them out. So, verse 10, the king took his signet ring from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. Keep the money, he said to Haman. Do with the people as you please. So this, of course, shows us that Xerxes is very sloppy and nonchalant in not asking for any details, not asking for any examples, like not even saying, what people are we talking about? Or who are these people? Or what have they done that's really, what laws have they broken? Or, he doesn't ask any follow-up questions, really. He just says, okay, Haman, well, if you think they're a problem, we'll get rid of them. And you don't have to pay for it. I'll pay for it. I'm wealthy and rich and powerful. We'll take care of it. Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead and do that. Go ahead and get rid of them. It says, then, on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all of Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, the nobles of the various peoples. They were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and little children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so that they would be ready for that day. So this, again, the king signs the executive order, doesn't ask very many questions, doesn't really, again, have any follow-up curiosity about it, and signs it with his signet ring, which, that's when they would put a seal on something in wax, and the king would have a special ring that would show that it was authentic. And they send this out to all the provinces, and apparently Persia had a pretty good system of a post office system, or a way to get the word out to all of the various places, which made it pretty efficient. So, verse 15, spurred on by the king's command, the couriers went out, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. So, this is now gone out. This order that on a particular day, the day that they picked by rolling the dice, they picked what day is going to be execution day, annihilation day of the Jews. And they basically said to all the provinces, all the rulers, all the princes and governors, and as they call satraps and various other muckety-mucks, this is the day that we're going to wipe out the Jews. And this word goes out, and obviously the Jews themselves read this and see this and go, we're doomed. We're doomed. They're going to kill us all on this day. This is the day on the calendar that we are all going to die. So this sets up a very rough situation for our heroes and our heroine at this point. Let me stop there a minute. What stands out to you about does this make you connect to our time, our day at all? Right. the reason the Jews obviously connected this very clearly with the Holocaust, with Hitler, as Haman is an early version of Hitler, and those Haman and Hitler are not the only two examples in history of people who attempted to get rid of the Jews. History is filled with attempts to eradicate the Jewish people. If you look through, there was times in, one of the tragedies of Christianity is in the Middle Ages, during the time of the Inquisition and others in the Middle Ages, there were overzealous officials who said, well, it was the Jews who killed Jesus. It was the Jews who were responsible for the murder of our Savior Jesus, and therefore they bear the mark, the blood blame for the death of Christ. They focused not on the Romans but on the Jews, and there were many persecutions of Jews in different times in the Middle Ages. When I was at OU, knowing that I was eventually going to, by the time I was pretty certain I was going to be going to seminary, I had the opportunity, I may have mentioned this before, I had the opportunity to take two classes with a rabbi, and they're at the Hillel Foundation, which was like the Wesley Foundation for Methodists. Well, the Hillel Foundation is the student organization for Jewish students. But I think all of us in the class were all Gentiles. Most of us wanting to get involved either in some sort of ministry and learn more about Judaism, or a variety of reasons for being in the class. But our professor, our rabbi, he told us a lot of stories about the persecution of Jews during different times in history, especially during the Middle Ages. And for example, during the Middle Ages, often Jews were required to wear certain clothing so that they would be identified as Jews. Yellow was often the color that Jews were required to wear. Sometimes Jewish men had to wear sort of these tall, pointy hats that we kind of think of either as a dunce cap or a wizard's hat, And so one of this is in, the 80s, early 80s, OU then, and I think now, had what they called a medieval fair. I think they call them Ren fairs now, Renaissance fairs, medieval fair, where they have all kinds of, activities related to the medieval times, things like jousting and sword fights and turkey legs and all that kind of stuff. But also, Renaissance music or medieval music and blah, blah, blah. Well, our assignment, those of us in the class, there was only, I think, 8 or 9 of us in the class. Our assignment was to create a booth at the Renaissance Fair giving information about what happened to the Jews during the medieval times. Information. And we all had to dress like Jews would dress in medieval times. So I was wearing a yellow robe with a yellow pointy hat. I had a fake beard. So I was there at the Renaissance Fair in this outfit of yellow pointy hat, yellow robe, fake beard, and we had this information booklet about what happened to the Jews. Like, Rabbi would say, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue, and Ferdinand expelled the Jews. Because that's what happened in that same year. All the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 as well. And some of the persecution, and this is more than 40 years ago. But one of the memories I still have from that is I'm there at the medieval fair in my medieval Jew outfit, and a little boy comes up to me who looks like he was 10 years old, and I've got the pointy hat, and I got the robe, and I have the beard, and he said, "Are you a wizard?" And I said, "No, I'm a I'm a Jew. I'm a medieval Jew. And he said, well, my daddy says the only good Jew is a dead Jew. And I said, well, your daddy's wrong about that. And I'm thinking, okay, he's 10 years old, and already he has been taught to hate Jews. And, you know, I'm thinking, people who scoff at anti-Semitism, they don't realize, you know, it's not just among pro-Palestinian people on college campuses. You know, there's anti-Semitism all over the place. And it's been a part of European culture and American culture for, well, ever since, you know, the events that we read about in the scriptures, this idea of exterminating the Jewish people. History is full of stories of attempts to, you know, to wipe out the Jews. And the Holocaust, of course, is maybe the most successful attempt at exterminating the Jews in terms of killing 6 million of them. One of the things that I, you know, was fortunate enough, or I'm very glad that I when we went to Poland to go to Auschwitz, and which was one of the death camps in Poland. And the Polish people are very important to say it was not a Polish death camp, it was a German death camp in Poland. It was the Germans who were running Auschwitz, not the Poles. But you can tour Auschwitz and see the living conditions and see, you know, examples of where the ovens were, where they burned the Jews, and the conditions were subhuman conditions, and the places where they collected their gold teeth, and the places where they, you know, all these things that were done to dehumanize the Jews in the death camps, and that was less than 100 years ago. I mean, that was in, you know, the 1930s and 40s. That wasn't that long ago. And so when you read about this story of Esther, I think it's particularly important to realize that this plot to exterminate Jews is not just a story in a book that happened a long time ago. It was something that happened then, and it's happened over and over and over again. You know, we definitely, you know, we believe in a Jewish Messiah, and a lot of our Jewish friends don't accept Jesus as that Messiah, but the hatred that has been expressed towards Jewish people across the centuries is just, you know, reprehensible and baffling at times. So anyway, that's why I think this story, even though it has some pretty comical ways of talking about things, like at the beginning with Vashti, and we can't let her get away with this because then the women will hear about it and then they'll start saying no. I mean, it has some, frankly, kind of comedic elements to it. But the essential part of it is a plot to exterminate a whole race of people. And, you know, again, spoiler alert, which you probably know, the point is, how does God rescue his people? Even though the name of God is not mentioned in the book, how does God rescue his people through a very unlikely heroine in this young girl, Esther? How does God use a very unlikely heroine to rescue his people out of this dilemma, this plot to exterminate them? So I think I want to, instead of the next sort of phase of the story, the next act of the story, I don't really want to get into because I can't get to all of it in 12 or 13 minutes. So any comments, thoughts, questions, impressions, maybe something that you've never really thought about in this book, or maybe never read this book. Maybe you've never really, this is one of those books, it's not very long, you know, you can read it in pretty much in one sitting, easily. But yeah. Yeah, doesn't ask questions, he just kind of, It's interesting, though, that we do have, as I say, we do have quite a bit of history of Xerxes from other sources. And Esther is only mentioned in the Bible. There's no mention of Esther in other Persian records. I mean, but there's lots about Xerxes and about the fact that he was hot-tempered, impatient, lust for power, and lust for women. I mean, those things are all part of his biography outside of the Bible, and we know that about him. And we know, as I say, that shortly after the events of this book, he attempted to invade Greece, which was basically the only part of the civilized world that he didn't control was Greece, and it ended in disaster for him. He was not able to take Greece. As a matter of fact, it cost him pretty much everything, and that's the beginning of the rise of the Greek Empire. So, anyway, other things. I think I'm going to wrap up a couple of minutes early. So, why don't we pray? Lord, we are thankful this evening for this story. It is stirring. It is powerful. It reminds us that you are at work sometimes in ways that we don't even realize, that you're at work behind the scenes sometimes, and we don't even know it or see it until we see your hand at work. We thank you for this story. We thank you that we, as followers of Jesus, have a rich heritage among Judaism and the Old Testament, and help us to always honor every people and never be dragged into prejudice and the kinds of things that humanity has often fallen into. We ask that you'd go with us now. Amen.